of this bill, which is repeal of the Parental Notification Act, was originally passed in 1995, but has only been enforced since 2013. Since then, over 500 young women have been forced to endure a traumatizing judicial bypass process in order to access reproductive health care in Illinois. And we know that that process creates an unfair and dangerous burden on these young women. We also know that the vast majority of young people who face an unwanted pregnancy involve a parent or trusted loved one. So there is nothing in the existing law that encourages or supports or maintains healthy family or parental involvement in a youth's life. The PNA is the last anti-abortion law that we have on our books in Illinois. Now is the time to repeal this law. Now is the time to pass the Youth and Healthy Safety Act to assure that we are protecting our most vulnerable young people in Illinois, and an urgent I vote. Thank you.
Is there any discussion? Leader Bourne.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Will the sponsor yield?
She indicates you yield.
Thank you, Representative. I know we had a robust conversation about this in committee, but I actually had a question come up in between time that I haven't had the opportunity to ask. We did talk about the working group and the members on that, and you clarified with me that the youth who will be represented on that task force would be under 18. Is that correct?
Yes, they will be youth. Yes.
Will they be required to get parental consent or notification to serve on that task force?
Not that I'm aware of. That's not part of the legislation.
Would it be similar to a field trip? I'm told other state agencies that have children under 18 on their task forces require parental consent.
I can find out the details on that, but I don't believe that would require consent or notification or anything like that. I mean, right now, most of us are meeting virtually via Zoom and doesn't require travel to begin with. So I would imagine this working group getting up and running will meet similarly via Zoom or some type of virtual format.
Okay, I think it's probably important to know that clarified before the end of the debate, if you could. To the bill, Mr. Speaker.
To the bill.
Thank you. It's a long-standing principle in this body and in our society and in the state that parents have the basic right to know what's happening in their minor child's life. In Illinois, there's a curfew, a law on the books that says if you have a child, the child cannot be out past midnight without the parent's consent, because we believe in this state that parents deserve to know where their children are, especially after midnight. That's consent, by the way, not notification. It's more strenuous than to receive an abortion without this bill. We also have laws that you've heard about. Can't get a tattoo without consent. Can't get a piercing without consent. Can't have a Tylenol at school. We talk about health care. They can't go to their school nurse and get a Tylenol without consent of their parents. Can't go on a field trip. Can't be on a state task force without consent. In fact, this body, just earlier this year, voted on House Bill 15, which is a good bill. We all voted for it, 114-0, twice. Voted for it the first time, voted for it when it came back on concurrence unanimously. And the sponsor of the bill succinctly, and I think very well, described the bill as, quote, parental notification would be required if a child at school is harmed or does harm to another student. And they would be required to be notified within 24 hours. And every single person in this body affirmed that. This is a basic case, not of parental control, which has been talked about by some on the other side of this issue from me. But it's about parents having the basic right to know what is going on in their minor child's life. It's so common sense. It's so common sense. We have a poll, which you've likely heard of, reputable polling firm, not a push poll, not some of these bogus things people do on campaigns, a legitimate poll. Says 72% of Illinoisans, a majority of those polled, by the way, self-identified as pro-choice, 72% of those Illinoisans said that parents or guardians should be notified if a minor girl, who's their daughter, is seeking an abortion. This isn't a partisan issue. It's not. It's not even down the lines of traditional pro-life and pro-choice lines. This is a basic common sense way for parents to know what's going on in their minor daughter's life. In fact, it's so basic. I've got a list here. If you ask me, what do these states have in common? Colorado, Delaware, Rhode Island, Virginia. You know what they all have in common? A few things. They all have a Democratic House, a Democratic Senate, and a Democratic governor. And you know what they also have in common? Colorado, Delaware, Rhode Island, Virginia, along with 33 other states, require that a parent be notified or give consent before their minor daughter receives an abortion. Those aren't exactly these scary, crazy Republican states that you guys like to talk about. That's how common sense this protection is. I'd also like to point out that parents obviously have a right to know when their child is undergoing a serious medical procedure. We talked about this briefly in committee, and I gave you the example. If my child broke their arm, needed to go get their arm set, I would want to know, and I would have the right to know. And it came up, one of the people testifying, a witness, offered that an abortion is so much more serious, so much different. To which I said, of course it is. Of course it is. A parent, obviously, if your child's having their tonsils taken out, setting a broken arm, ruptured appendix, of course the parent has the right to know what's happening. But an abortion has so much more an impact on a minor daughter's mental and physical health than a broken arm. If a parent deserves to know about a broken arm, then holy cow, they deserve to know if their daughter's considering an abortion. And I also want to talk about the contention in committee that the only people who would oppose this bill must want there to be no abortions, which the poll we've already talked about proves that's not the case. But I'll tell you what, for parents who've been notified that their minor daughter is considering an abortion and they support it, they support that decision, I want them to know. I want them to be able to drive their daughter to the abortion clinic. I want them to be there to care for that daughter afterwards. I want them to know just as much as I want a parent to know who may be pro-life, who may vehemently disagree with that decision, but I still want them to support their daughter in that decision. I want them to be there for them. That's what this bill requires. That the parents have the opportunity to know what's happening in their daughter's life. There's been a lot of conversation, especially in committee, about how broken the PNA is, the Parental Notification of Abortion. It's a very short bill. I would hope that everybody in this chamber has read this by now, but I wanted to point out a few things. because it seems to be that the major point of contention with this bill is with the judicial bypass. And there's been a lot of misinformation about what is required of a judicial bypass. So I want to read it. Exemptions to parental notification. So in all of these cases, parental notification is waived. If the minor is accompanied by a person entitled to notice, the parent takes them to the clinic, no need to notify. Notice is waived in writing by a person who is entitled to notice. Parent writes a note, says, you don't need to notify me, I already know. Good to go. The attending physician certifies that the patient's medical record and that medical emergency exists, and there is insufficient time to provide the required notice. This came up in committee today, that it could be that it's delayed so long through the bypass that they're unable to receive the abortion, or that it's an emergency. The plain text of the language says that's not the case. It would already be waived. The minor declares in writing that she is a victim of sexual abuse, neglect, physical abuse by an adult family member as defined in this act. This attending physician must certify in the patient's medical record that he or she has received the written declaration of abuse or neglect, and it goes on. So for those who are experiencing the horrible, horrible situation that they have been abused, neglected, the whole list, they don't have to go through the judicial bypass, and they don't have to notify their parents. And I'd like to add to that, they don't ever have to notify their parents. The body that does the notification is the clinic. It's not the daughter. We don't force the daughter to call the mom and tell them. We don't. This isn't what was described in committee as cruel. We're not being cruel. We're allowing parents basic knowledge of a serious medical procedure that their daughter is contemplating. And they don't have to tell their parents. It's the clinic that does it. I'd like to talk a bit about girls who aren't in this state. We obviously swear to uphold our state constitution and serve our citizens of Illinois. But we have a much bigger responsibility in this bill. Today we heard from a clinic in the Metro East that said 50% of their minors come from out of state, most of which come from states with parental notification or parental consent, meaning it's the will of those states that parents have basic rights to know. If this bill passes, I can only expect that that number will increase from 50%, meaning that the bill you're voting on today will mean that parents states away, potentially, have no opportunity or right to know that their minor daughter has come to Illinois for an abortion. And when I talk about minor daughters, I want to put this into context. Before the RHA, we got reports on the age. And this might sound actually pretty extreme to say, but we have examples of 12-year-olds receiving abortions in Illinois. 12-year-olds. We're not talking about 17-year-olds exclusively who are months away from being 18. We're talking about middle schoolers, potentially. Parents of middle schoolers not having the right to know that their daughter is going through this, and not having the full knowledge to know what happens afterwards, right? She has that procedure. Something goes wrong, she's depressed, they have no context, no knowledge of why that's happening. So today, all I'm asking for you is to be consistent. Be consistent with the votes after votes that you've taken that have allowed parents basic knowledge and involvement in their minor children's life. That's all. Because for much as you want to write a big political statement about what you did to support women, voting for this is failing girls. And it's failing good parents. We've seen a lot of hyper-partisan talk in this country about parents' rights recently. I acknowledge that. But there is nothing more basic than a parent and child relationship where the parent has the right to know what's happening. Not to control it, not to make the decision for the daughter, but to know. Please be consistent. Please vote no.
Representative Gahn Dershowitz.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Will the sponsor yield?
She indicates she'll yield.
I stand today in support of repealing the Parental Notification Act. I want to be very clear and dispel some of the misinformation about what this law does and who it will apply to. It's easy to paint a picture that teen girls want to avoid telling their parents about their sex life, but that's not reality. It's not true, and it's not who this law is intended to protect. The youth seeking to get around parental notification are not coming from the ideal, healthy situations that we would hope for all of our children. They are in incredibly dangerous situations. By and large, we're talking about young women who are abused mentally, emotionally, physically, and sexually. This includes young women who are at risk of possibly losing their home, being kicked out, and relying on state services and homeless shelters. For some of them, their lives may be in danger with pregnancy. And to be clear, you should not have to be in a dire situation to be granted agency to make your own reproductive choices. We've heard several members talk about how they would want to know if their child is making this type of decision. Of course we would. And we would hope and assume that most of our kids are in a functional, comfortable household where they would come to us. That's because we have healthy relationships. This law doesn't remove the relationships parents have with their children. Again, this law does not remove healthy relationships parents have with their children. In fact, no law we pass is going to suddenly compromise a healthy relationship between a young woman and her parents. We're talking about those who don't have the privilege of having a healthy relationship with their parent, and that is their judgment to make. Prior to becoming a legislator, I represented child trafficking victims, children who were sold by their parents, for whom home was not a safe place, and parents were not trusted adults. Repealing PNA will help those who can't trust their parents receive the health care and reproductive health care they need, and as is their right. I urge an aye vote.
Further discussion, Representative Dittich.
To the bill. I rise in support of House Bill 370. I've received outreach from several constituents about this bill, and I would like to take the opportunity to explain my position on this issue. I support a woman's right to choose. The decision of whether to terminate or carry a pregnancy to term is one of the most personal, emotional, and impactful decisions that any person will make in their entire life. My view is that the appropriate parties to make that decision is the woman herself, her health care provider, and trusted loved ones who the woman chooses to include in that decision-making process. It's a decision that should be made without the interference or the involvement of the government, or by politicians or judges who are hundreds or thousands of miles away. What the parental notice of abortion law does is it substitutes our judgment in this room in Springfield in place of the judgment of the person who is about to make a life-altering decision. Now, we know most girls do choose to involve their parents in this decision. Before the PNA, over 85% of girls involved their parents. Right now, over 85% of girls are involving their parents. And after we repeal the PNA, over 85% of girls will still involve their parents. So the question before us today is, what do we do with the about 15% of girls who fear that involving their parents will lead to or perpetuate emotional, financial, physical, or sexual abuse? Right now, we force those girls to navigate a complex judicial bureaucracy, maybe hire a lawyer, and convince a judge that she is telling the truth, that forcing her to involve her parents will put her in danger. I think we should handle it differently. I think when a girl tells us that she's in danger, we should just believe her. Abortion services are a legitimate component of reproductive health care, and it's time for Illinois to treat it just like any other form of reproductive health care. With so many states moving backwards, now is the time for Illinois to move forward and repeal the PNA. This bill makes it clear that in Illinois we trust women and that every single person in our state has the right to safe, legal, and affordable reproductive health care. I strongly urge an aye vote.
Further discussion, Representative Boss.
I first request verification.
Representative Boss has requested a verification.
Thank you, Speaker. To the bill.
To the bill.
I rise today not just as a concerned father, but as an advocate who has spent years fighting the epidemic of sex trafficking. Most recently, my advocacy was spent working with an organization in our very state that operates the only one single house, one single safe house for minors, children. I know we keep hearing women being thrown around. We're talking about children when it comes to this bill. These children who have been rescued from sexual abuse, exploitation, and trafficking. They've housed and helped girls as young as just 10 years old. 10 years old. If you're not aware, the average age of entry for a victim of sex trafficking in the U.S. is between 12 and 14 years. But for many, that abuse started well before they became victims of trafficking. And after drug dealing, human trafficking is the fastest growing criminal enterprise in the world. And I guarantee you that this is happening and impacts every single community that is represented here on this floor today. This bill that is being presented, if it were to pass, would further advance that criminal enterprise by emboldening the pimps, the traffickers, those who rape and sexually assault and exploit these children. Because of parental notification, there are girls here in this state whose loved ones have been able to locate them, rescue them from their traffickers, and bring them home so they can find hope and healing. This is not hyperbole. This is fact. This is fact. I have looked into the eyes of one of these girls. I've seen a pain that you cannot know. But I've also seen healing that was able to happen after her rescue. A rescue that happened because her parents were notified. I ask you today to stand with this brave girl and all the other victims. Stand with these girls. It is our responsibility as legislators to pass laws that protect our most vulnerable children and not put them at greater risk. If this passes, you will be allowing those who victimize and abuse children, not just here in Illinois, but from all over the U.S., to to walk their victims into a clinic, force them to have an abortion, hide the evidence of their crime, and continue this cycle of violence. Do not further empower those pimps, those traffickers, those who rape, sexually abuse, and exploit these children for their own personal and selfish gains. Vote no.
Further discussion, Representative Cassidy.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. We've heard some very interesting debate tonight. You know, I stood here in May of 2019 and had a lengthy debate, not unlike this, in which we described building a firewall around Illinois to protect reproductive health care and to protect access to this care. But that firewall has a gaping hole in it, and it's a gaping hole that puts our most vulnerable people, the folks that we are most charged with protecting, it puts them in danger. We have to plug that hole today by repealing PNA. Heard lots of folks over there talking about all of the things that you can't do without contacting a parent, piercings and whatnot, that frankly trivialize what we're talking about here. But nobody over there wants to talk about the things you can do without contacting a parent. You can get pregnant. You can stay pregnant. You can give birth. You can have a C-section. You can give a child up for adoption, all without ever having anybody call your parent. So to say that this is not about abortion, that this is some high-minded protection idea for y'all, is a flat-out lie. It is a complete lie. It is a fiction. It treats a pregnant minor seeking an abortion far differently than pregnant minors seeking other forms of health care. So yes, my friends, it is absolutely about abortion. And we are seeing it all over the country. Anti-abortion politicians all across the country are seeking to curb our access to abortion for anyone and everyone. They literally want to just force us all to keep every pregnancy to term, regardless of what's happening, regardless of the risks to our lives. Illinois is different, and it's going to stay different. And we're going to finish the work today by closing the loophole in our firewall. I feel like everybody over there is talking about this magical, mythical world. Like, did you all grow up in Lake Wobegon, where all the women are strong and the children are above average and everybody's got a perfect family? Because let me tell you what it's really like, folks. I left home at 16 to escape my father's drunken anger. And I thank God every day that I didn't face an unintended pregnancy at that time, because not only would I put myself at risk by having to have my father find out, you know what else I would have been doing? I would have been putting my mother in danger, because when I left, she was the only one left behind to face his rage. That's what these families that we're trying to protect the children of are experiencing. I would have spoken to my mother, but I also would have known that in so doing, I was setting her up for another beating. The beatings that I ran away from because I couldn't take it anymore. That's the reality on the ground, y'all. And these are the people that we should be doing everything we can to protect. Illinois is different. In Illinois, we trust women to make decisions about their bodies. We trust people to control their reproductive health. and to make that mission complete. Today, I urge an aye vote. Repeal PNA. Do it now. Thank you.
Representative Moeller to close.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. We've heard some very emotional and, quite frankly, misleading and hyperbolic rhetoric from the other side of the aisle. I am a mother of 2 teenage daughters. My relationship with Madeline, who's 18, and Eleanor, who is 16, is the most important relationship in my life. I have worked, it's tough to be a parent. It's tough to be a parent of teenage daughters. But I have worked since the day they were born to develop a relationship with them where they trust me, where they can come to me and talk to me about what is going on in their life. This bill is not about them. This bill is not about your children. This bill is about the children in our state who live in such dangerous family situations that over the last 8 years, we've had over 500 young women go through a judicial bypass process in order to access health care that is constitutionally guaranteed for them because they can't go to their parents. And this is no easy, minor bureaucratic process. This involves a young woman hiring an attorney on her own, setting up a court date, finding a way to get to court, standing in front of a judge in a courtroom that's generally a venue for criminal activities, explaining why she's pregnant, explaining why she needs to have an abortion, and why she can't go to her parents to let them know about that. Imagine a 17-year-old young woman already in a very vulnerable position having to go through that process. We've had over 500 young women in this state since 2013 because this process was established in 1995 by people who want to restrict access to abortion and reproductive health care in our state. This had nothing to do with supporting young people. This had nothing to do with guaranteeing that parents were involved in their child's life. If they cared about those types of relationships, they wouldn't have required a 17-year-old to find a way to a judge to get permission and divulge incredibly sensitive personal information to a complete stranger to get their permission to have access to health care. This law was put into place to prevent women from having access to reproductive health care. Plain and simple. That was it. But now it's being wrapped in this misleading hyperbole about parents. It's a fiction, as my colleague from Chicago just said. We cannot force young people in this situation, in these terrible, traumatic situations, to endure this process any longer. We trust women in Illinois. We support the most vulnerable in our state. This law is dangerous. It's harmful. It's harming young people in the state. Let's support our youth. Let's create a supportive and healthy environment for them. I urge an aye vote. Thank you very much.
On this question, there are 62 voting yes, 51 voting no, 3 voting present. The House does concur in Senate Amendments number 1 and 2 to House Bill 370, and this bill has received a constitutional majority and is hereby declared passed.
Thanks for watching, and if you haven't already, please consider subscribing to our channel. And while you're at it, please leave us a comment. Thank you for watching.